Good morning. I'm Tom Emerson. I'm an architect based in London and co-founder with Stephanie MacDonald of 6A Architects, which we've been running for just over 20 years, since 2001. I decided to study architecture, I guess, in the mid-80s. I was at school, I was a teenager, and I grew up in Belgium, and for a year my parents had a sabbatical in the US, they're academics, and we lived in the US for a year in just outside Boston, in a town called Lexington in Massachusetts, where we stayed in for a year in a house, in a kind of 1950s modernist house, which was one of a whole settlement that I later found out was designed by the Architects Collaborative for themselves and their families. There's, I think, maybe about 20 houses. And coming from suburban Belgium to this kind of modernist Arcadia, I became interested in the people who lived on that street. They were often quite old because they were the original owners. And I remember being told that they were architects. And I was kind of sort of blown away by 80s America and this sort of modernity. Everything felt more modern. High school felt more modern. And so somehow it was the first time that architecture had, or meeting an architect had come into my mind. And I found the whole thing very exciting. And then, okay, that was a fairly superficial view of architecture, but then over the following years, I realized that maybe some of the things that I was interested coincided. So I was always kind of quite into making. From an early age, I was into drawing, I was into photography, and somehow that all felt like the things that you would do at architecture school would be the sorts of things that I was quite interested in anyway. And you know, the rest sort of followed fairly naturally. I think now I feel overwhelmingly like a Londoner, and probably like a lot of Londoners. I'm not from London. I was born in France. I grew up in Belgium. And I came to the UK for university. But I've been here since the early mid-90s. And, you know, once I met Steph, who is a real Londoner, and she'll tell you in a moment, Steph is actually born and bred in London. Once we set up the office, once we were together, and then in '99 our son was born, and I felt like by then that was where the roots were going down. That's also the sensibility somehow was developed. London in the mid-90s was kind of very exciting, particularly in terms of things like popular culture and fashion and design. And I was at college where I met Steph at the Royal College of Art, and it really felt like, compared with the other places I'd grown up, this was the one where I felt most comfortable, most at home, most excited to live and work in. So probably like a lot of people, when you're 18, 19 years old, you don't really know the differences in architecture schools, the different positions and stuff. You know, it's just, you know, this new field that you're stepping into. I did my undergraduate degree in Bath, which is in the west of England, not because I chose it. It was the only place that I was accepted. So, but it turns out that it was actually a great school. And it was a school that had really been shaped by the Smithsons in the 80s. I arrived in '89, so just as the Smithsons were retiring, but somehow the ethos of the school was set, and it was one which was based around kind of a very nice, a very sort of progressive idea of collaboration and interdisciplinary things. So there was a lot of collaboration between architects and engineers, particularly people like Ted Happold were there, the founder of Bureau Happold, Max Fordham, who was one of the pioneers of sustainability and low energy, low carbon design. And but while it had a sort of technical background, it, you know, in a sense, also this sort of, it had a very strong kind of modernist ethos that came from the Smithsons and then through other people. The school was actually designed by the Smithsons. It's one of their kind of later work. So you were sort of really in it in quite a kind of, not just in a sort of didactic way, in a kind of environmental way. That was, there was a very strong sense of their position there. But by the time I left, I felt like I wanted a very different environment. And so for graduate studies, I came to London and then went to the Royal College of Art, which is where I met Steph. And she had arrived there through a kind of art school trajectory. So we had two different routes that then coincided at the RCA, which we only stayed in for a year. But that was enough to somehow kind of give us a kind of focus on what we wanted to do and the sort of work we wanted to make. And so after leaving the RCA, I went to Cambridge, where people like Eric Parry was teaching, and Peter Beard, and Steph went to London Met, which is almost like a kind of, they're almost like brother-sister schools, where quite young Caruso St. John were teaching, and people like Florian Bagel, and so on. So she went to London Met, I went to Cambridge. When we graduated, I came back to London. She was already in London. And then that's when we started. We didn't start the practice immediately, but that's when we started thinking about the idea of having our own practice and doing our own work. And then it was a sort of fairly slow start, partly related to the birth of our son and having kind of flexibility to work how we wanted to work. So we did a few projects around that time, quite small residential ones, but it was really in 2001 when we did Okini, which was a very experimental kind of online fashion store in Savile Row, which is the home of English tailoring. So the most traditional street in London with the most kind of radical retail concept. It was a shop where you couldn't buy anything, right? So you could go in and there would be clothes there, limited edition pieces by new designers, by big brands, all mixed together, everything limited. And then you had to order online, which in 2001 was really radical. And people thought it was completely mad. But I remember when we were there once with the founder of Okini, who said, "Oh, you do realize very soon you'll be doing this on your phone." And everybody kind of laughed and just thought, this is ridiculous. We looked at our kind of Nokia phones and thought, this is so annoying to use. But of course, he had a very good sense of where the future was going. So the whole store was based around, it was somewhere between a bedroom and a museum, not a shop. So there was no point of sale. And it just had these big piles of felt everywhere that you just lay clothes on as if you were putting them on your bed at home. And the whole place was on a slope because the street was on a slope. So it was a little bit like an extension of the pavement. And, but that was really our first project became visible. And it was done about the same time as OMA's Prada epicenter. So somehow there was this, not because of our project, mainly because of the OMA project, there was a lot of interest in this sort of interaction between kind of leisure, culture and fashion. And maybe we were lucky that Okini sort of fit that kind of fit that kind of way of thinking, fit that moment. And so it sort of became quite visible for a couple of years. So that was really just sort of our entrance into it. Yes, no, we definitely did have some mentors, which I would say the first one that, let's say, was shared with me and Steph was meeting the artist Richard Wentworth at the RCA, at the Royal College of Art. He came and did a sort of short kind of workshop project there, but then we saw him doing various talks, and he's an artist he's a sculptor, but he's also very well known for his talk called Making, Do and Getting By, which is kind of photography led. He does a lot of street photography, particularly documenting how a city is made and how it's repaired and how it's improvised by people when they're not thinking about design. So it's almost like when their kind of natural cultural impulses become visible. And Richard became an extremely important person to us. He, as a kind of way of seeing the world, as a way of being attentive to history, as being attentive to almost social habits, the everyday. And then later on, I ended up editing a piece, publishing a piece with him. Steph organised some things with him, a talk, I think, at the at London Met, and so he remains a very important person to us. He's somehow a kind of like a kind of mentor, like somebody who always reflects a kind of alternative light onto what you do, not just what we do, but also onto how you see the world. So he's extremely perceptive and funny, and I think has been, a very important kind of inspiration for us. So I think that was one of the key ones. Then probably there's a few others who are not people that we met, but people that we read. And for me, it was particularly the French writer Georges Perec, who, as I said before, I had a background in France and Belgium, so I can I speak and read French. And through another friend, discovered Perec, Species of Spaces, but particularly Life a User's Manual, and his project called Lieux, Places. And that became a kind of almost like a literary version of maybe some of the sensibility that we found in Richard's work. And that became a sort of subject of interest and kind of research and writing during the final years at university, and which was then also brought a kind of this idea of, again, the everyday. I think Perec calls it the infraordinary, those things that we don't normally see, but nevertheless are kind of fundamental to how a culture operates, how a city is made. He's an amazing storyteller, and somehow storytelling became sort of part of the kind of methodology of the practice of how do you put together all the little clues and discoveries that you make when working, and how do they become material that you can use as a kind of design engine. So they were two early, two very important early influences. And then, there was a certain architecture scene that was known as the Whisperers in London in the mid-90s. I think it's kind of partly critical, partly affectionate term. Who were architects that really coming out of people like Tony Fretton and Florian Bagel. You have people like Crusoe St. John in there, who were looking to make to provide an alternative position to the dominant either postmodern or high-tech position of the big architects of the kind of 80s and 90s, and particularly at the sort of end of the Thatcherite era. So there were people who were much more engaged in the city, they were much more influenced by work that was going on in continental Europe, in Portugal, in Porto, Caesar or Basel, early Herzog and de Meuron. They were very political. And so they were Steph's teachers. Steph and I were both taught by Tony. So they were also very important kind of influences, as well as things like early Herzog and de Meuron, amazing work. Caesar's work, particularly the way in which he could bring together a very intuitive sensibility towards place with a kind of political program was very inspiring. And there was nothing like that in England. So those were the sort of kind of key early, I would say early influences, but we were very, and then I would say at the same time, because these influences and mentors were very much about how you perceive the world, how you observe it and how you document it. Other things were very important at the time, as I mentioned, popular culture, fashion, music, and visual arts was very, very productive and energetic in London at the time. So we were sort of not just being architecture geeks, we were also enjoying, I think one of the first house conversions, like a little domestic conversion, was for a record producer, and then that brought us into the kind of orbit of musicians and filmmakers, and so it was impossible to go out in London only with architects. There were many more people doing many other things. So that was very much part of the mix, which is, I think, one of the reasons why I feel like quite connected to London, more so than, let's say, where I spent my childhood in Belgium, which was perfectly happy, but it was suburban in a small country. So setting up in London, I think there's no recipe to it. Every practice has its own origin story. For us, it was Steph and I, who met at college, and we were together as a couple. And then there were a couple of other people, Alex Ely and Lee Marsden, who were also friends that we'd met at college. But very quickly, it was actually three of us. Alex went off and did his own thing very successfully, a practice called May. And then there isn't a very well-developed competition culture in the UK. There are competitions, but they're not great for starting out, because generally there's a pre-qualification that requires certain things. So it was really quite networked through people we met at the RCA. So the house for the record producer, for example, was a friend of a friend of a friend met in a bar somewhere or at an exhibition opening. And then Okini came out of the same milieu. It was a group of people who were based around a design practice called Tomato. In the 90s, Tomato was huge in London. It was a kind of collective that did graphics, very, very early stages of interactive design, digital design. They did stuff in movies, stuff in music, and they were very, very well networked. So it was through them that we were asked to do a small competition for Okini. I think it was three young practices who all went in for it, and we won it. We built it, and it was extremely exciting. And then we designed a few exhibitions, but you know, exhibitions don't really pay the way. We did a few house conversions, which is very typical for young architects in London. So house extensions, house conversions, that's a sort of, you know, we did a few of those. And then I think it was, then we carried on doing competitions. And in 2005, we won a competition in France for some housing, for some social housing. It was never built because by the autumn of that year, 2005 or 2006, I don't remember, there were some big riots in the banlieue, and then it became politically impossible to build more social housing at that moment. So anyway, the project was cancelled, but it gave us, you could say, a bit of confidence to keep going, because, you know, it was pretty tough, to be honest. So you make ends meet by some teaching. So I was teaching at the AA at the time. From 2004, I think, or 99 to 2004, I was teaching at the AA. So that was a little bit, you know, that helps with the overall sort of project. And we made a little publication, very small publication, I think it was 2004, with a few projects, a couple of projects built and a couple of competition projects, and we sent them to people who we thought would be, you know, that we'd like to work for. So kind of museums and galleries were very interested in pursuing, I suppose, the connection to the arts that was kind of important to us. And of course, nothing happened. But we got some very nice responses. And maybe a year later, we were invited to be in a kind of, I suppose, a small competitive environment and selection to do Raven Row, which was about the same time as the competition in France. So Raven Row, which was a new not-for-profit contemporary art exhibition centre in Spitalfields in East London, in and around two 18th century silk mercers' houses. And that was really a really big change. That suddenly went from, you know, the 6A being a very small and kind of hand-to-mouth practice, that both the competition in France and being commissioned for Raven Row meant that we were able to kind of professionalize. So maybe, as you say, but from going from 2 to 3, 4 people, that suddenly we were able to, you know, get decent computers and decent software and actually organize ourselves. Then very quickly after getting Raven Row, we won a little competition to do South London Gallery. So South London Gallery, which is also a not-for-profit, it's a kind of public contemporary art space with a very strong community and outreach program. Also, both projects were reuse projects, so adaptations, transformations of existing buildings and extensions. And it was interesting because at the time, we were obviously very excited by doing them. We kind of probably didn't realize how formative those would be, both in terms of our own work, but in terms of, let's say, the trajectory of the architecture would take. You know, that now, you know, reuse and transformation is on everybody's lips. At the time, it still felt like, you know, you hadn't quite made it as an architect because you were still transforming things. But in the end, I think it turned out that it was really great for us that those were our first public projects. And that's where we really, these projects which were, particularly Raven Row, which had a kind of mad history in terms of who built them, who lived there, how the city kind of rose in the 18th and 19th century and then kind of collapsed again and became a kind of slum and a ruin. Fires, immigration, all went through and left their traces in these places. And we became really interested in working out how do you use this sort of very deep and embedded kind of experience that a place accumulates, and how does that become part of your operations as a contemporary architect. And South London Gallery and Raven Row became somehow, because they were going on at the same time, became almost like the models, kind of methodological models for then future work. And as they finished around 2009, 2010, we won a competition to design some student accommodation in Cambridge. So by then I was teaching in Cambridge, and the head of school organised a competition, a big competition actually, and we were invited to be part of it. I think there were like 20 offices, which we won. And that was for a new building. And which then got cancelled because of the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, 2010. But it came back in 2012. So suddenly we were working at a kind of bigger scale, and it was a new building. It was very kind of low energy building, sort of timber framed with reclaimed materials and reclaimed oak on the facade and things like that. And that was, again, really exciting because we were doing that, you know, well before people were talking about circularity. You know, that wasn't a word that was used in architecture. We were just excited to do this project and to try and find ways of making it very low energy building, both in construction and in use. And about the same time, we started working on the studio for Jürgen Teller, the photographer Jürgen Teller here in London. And that was also a kind of exercise in low energy construction, but very different. The idea there was, because the two projects were going simultaneously, was we were going to do, one of them was going to be very low embodied energy, so high insulation, you know, great thermal envelope. And the other one would have high embodied energy, but with lots of thermal mass and very passive in its kind of heating and cooling, because you had this sort of a lot of concrete and a lot of masonry. The discourse has changed a lot now, and so one might do it quite differently now. But at the time, the two buildings were essentially two different models of low energy building. And Jürgen's project also then had the added element of gardens and biodiversity, and that's when we became very, I mean, we had been interested in landscape and biodiversity, but that was the one where we were able to really play it out in a kind of, at an equivalent level to the architecture. So the building is actually very long and thin from the street, and it's basically building, garden, building, garden, building, garden. A whole sequence of these sort of interiors and exteriors of about the same scale. And the whole thing is imagined like a kind of ruin where the sort of, where the nature has sort of taken over these buildings, which are both new but also have elements of previous buildings in them. And so that was so projects sort of felt like they came in pairs, you know, which was very interesting because it meant that it kind of helped us have a kind of focus on things. And then by then the practice was, you could say, a bit bigger, and then we were doing, you know, many other projects at the same time. We did then further stages of South London Gallery. There was we did a garden, the Orozco garden, so garden with Gabriel Orozco, the Mexican artist, in South London Gallery. And then there was another phase, the fire station. We did some other contemporary galleries, a private one for Sadie Cole's HQ, and the Perimeter, which is a private collection. And I suppose that led to later. And so most of these projects come through limited competitions. Then there was a series of projects which are, you could say, the collateral commissions out of public work. So all of these galleries have boards of trustees, and sometimes after you finish, let's say the South London Gallery, one of the trustees invites you to do a residential project for them, like a new house. Or so we ended up, we don't do many, but we've done a few one-off houses. We started doing, in 2010, I started teaching at ETH, and then we started doing more competitions in continental Europe. And we won a competition in Hamburg for Happen City for some housing, which finished during the pandemic. I think it was 2015, and it finished in sometime in 2020. We don't know because everybody was locked up at home, so we didn't actually see it finished until much later. But then we continued with gallery work and more. We did more artist studios and galleries, Milton Keynes Gallery, MK Gallery in Milton Keynes, which was then quite a different outcome because the building is quite sort of techy, quite high tech and quite poppy, but in our mind, very similar to the process of Raven Row, which is about a building which aims to pull together some of the sort of invisible narratives of the city. And Milton Keynes has an amazing kind of social utopian origin, which was very powerful in the first phases of the city's making, but then sort of disappeared during kind of from the 80s onwards, or didn't disappear completely, but faded away. And by the end of the 20th century was kind of lost a little bit. And we were very keen to sort of think about what might that utopian vision be like in the 21st century. So the building tries to somehow reimagine some of the design history and of the city, and it was incredibly exciting. But in many ways, very similar to Raven Row, but just the source material is different. It's not 18th century, 19th century immigrant London. It's 1960s and 1970s kind of optimism of the welfare state with a bit of psychedelia mixed in. So, so then the aesthetics becomes different, but the method continues to develop. And, that brings us sort of quite close to the present time. So from there, at the moment, we're working on Tate Liverpool, which is another reuse project. So it was a 19th century dock warehouse on Liverpool waterfront, converted in the 80s by James Sterling into Tate of the North, and then it became Tate Liverpool. And then now it's been converted again because it's been sort of 40 years nearly. And, it can't cope with the number of visitors, and also expectations of what an institution like that have changed a lot to make it more accessible, to reach out particularly to communities within Liverpool, particularly more disadvantaged communities. And then who knows, that might even, Steph will probably talk about this in a bit, but that might well extend into a much bigger rethinking of Liverpool waterfront in kind of community, cultural and ecological terms. So those are things we're thinking about at the moment. And that kind of goes alongside, I'm still teaching at ETH, I've been there now for 14 years. And a lot of these themes of reuse, bricolage, landscape design, biodiversity, gardening, making are kind of in the research that we do there, collaboration, including things like some of the live projects or the real design and build projects like the one we did in Pachacamac in Peru. with the Catholic University. So there were students, Peruvian students, ETH students working together to kind of design and build this structure in archaeological park. We've also got a live garden project in Zurich. It's a very long-running sort of landscape project that every semester a new cycle of students kind of manages, maintains, and then adds to. So bringing in all those, I suppose all those kind of current themes about, what is the environment, what is the built environment, what's the natural environment, have we got the right understanding, the right balance between everything, can we reconcile those opposites of nature and culture, which are sort of quite well scripted in contemporary discourse now. But can we find new design methods, and so on. So the practice is now, I don't know, mid-30s, I would say, in numbers of people. It has been mid-40s, but it's been quite stable in the mid-30s. And yeah, it continues to go. And I think it's still, in my mind, it still feels like very much a London-based practice. And it's, even though probably less than half the people in 6A are actually British. But being British not being British does not stop you from being a Londoner. I think that's one of the great things about being a Londoner, is you can come from anywhere. It's a bit like being a New Yorker. A New Yorker can be from anywhere. It's a sort of, it's in the mind, as it were. So, and we're working now in Melbourne, we finished our project in Hamburg, but we just finished one in New York, which is a kind of not-for-profit art space called CARA, the Center for Arts Research and Alliances, which is a really, really interesting new organization in West Village, that's sort of taking, let's say, the whole notion of kind of research and collaboration, publication, exhibition making, performance, into a whole new field with a whole new set of participants and artists involved, particularly ones who traditionally have not been part of the kind of contemporary art world, or not been massively visible. They've always been practicing. But anyway, CARA was a really exciting project to work in New York, because it's a different ball game, working in New York from working in Europe. But we absolutely loved it. We had a wonderful client, a wonderful site, a wonderful program. So we'd love to do more in the US. But also we're working in Athens at the moment, and in Sweden. We won a competition last year for housing project in a former cement works on the riverfront in Limhamn. So maritime ecology and industrial ruins and all of that sort of mixing together again, it's the sort of themes that go on and on and on in our work. Again, played out there with some great collaborators in Sweden. So a lot of our work is very collaborative, either with artists or with other architects. I'm sure Steph will tell you about Bedford House, which is a community centre. Holborn House, sorry, it was renamed. Holborn House, just around the corner from here, which is a community centre, which we did with the artist Cara Turing. MK Gallery, we also did it with two artists, Gareth Jones and Niels Norman. So that's a very important part of our work, these collaborations. So that's sort of gets us more or less up to the present day, I think. Yeah, so I've been teaching for a long time, and I couldn't say whether it's important or not important for a practice. I have taught as long as I've practiced, so I don't know any better. So this is just part of the way things go for me and for us. I think for us, it has been a very interesting space beside the office, where some of the themes that are live in the office, in projects, can be somehow extracted and amplified in a kind of in another situation. Maybe they're given more time to develop, and then can kind of be brought back in a kind of slightly different shape. So different methodologies and so on. So that is definitely the case, that in my mind they exist together. I couldn't quite pull them apart. And I'm certainly I've never been interested in a way of teaching where I teach people how to do 6A projects. That I have absolutely no interest in at all. I'm much more interested in bringing questions that we might be finding kind of exciting and challenging, and then somehow giving that question a different point of view and a different way of being explored. And you're right that we also, in the teaching, there's a lot of making, or there has been. Initially, it was these kind of very fast, collaborative construction projects, usually using secondhand material, reclaimed material and stuff. Very quick, usually a couple of weeks. The making was never that important to me, to be honest. And a lot of people think that sort of somehow have an unhealthy interest in craft or whatever. I sort of have an interest in craft, but I'm also quite suspicious of it. The thing that was more interesting in doing these design and build projects is the way that they build collaboration. And you can talk about collaboration in theory forever, but until you do it, you've got no idea what it is. And so doing these projects, people get to know each other. You have to. If you're holding the other end of a piece of wood, I have to trust you, you have to trust me. So there's a huge amount of communication is involved, a huge amount of relationship building is involved without even knowing that you're doing it. And generally, when you finish one of these projects, the group of people who've done it are really tight. And then for the remainder of the semester, as I say, these things take about 2 weeks. For the remainder of the semester, the level of communication and co-teaching amongst students is much, much higher if they've done this thing together, if they've been up late and they've had drinks afterwards, or they've made meals together, or all these sorts of social tissue is kind of grown. And that was the main motivation for it. Then I also found in teaching, and maybe it's a slightly practical thing, that the first couple of weeks of semesters are really slow when people do research. They go to the library, they look at maps. The reality is nothing really happens. So to do these projects is really fast. So by 2 weeks into the thing, there's a building that 50 people, 48 people have made, and it exists, and there's a big party. And there's a sense of momentum that comes out of that people they're kind of doing before they're thinking. And I really like that sense of direct action, that sort of very spontaneous way of working. And then maybe you spend the rest of the semester trying to work out what it means. But don't worry about it at the beginning, just do it. And we were doing projects where one semester they would design and build this kind of fairly reasonably sized structure. And then the next group would have to take it down and then rebuild something else with it. And then you carry on in this kind of endless cycle of recycling and remaking, and a huge amount of energy came out of it. Eventually we ended up doing a couple of bigger ones. One was a Belvedere, which is still there about 10 years later. It's like a staircase that leads to a view of the lake in one of the hills in Zurich. And then the other one was the headquarters for Manifesta, for the Contemporary Art Biennale, the travelling one when it came to Zurich. And it was this kind of floating pavilion in the middle of the lake, which was really wild. And that was much more ambitious. That took much longer than 2 weeks. But nevertheless, it still had this kind of collective action and both design, making, and so on. But then after that, I sort of decided that was enough. That somehow there were enough of these pavilions in the world, and maybe we had been about as ambitious as we could with that type of work. So that's when I started the garden. So the idea was then to kind of get away from this kind of pavilion building business and actually start a much, much slower landscape project. Because I realized that the one thing you can't simulate in architecture school is the passage of time. Because of the academic calendar, you know, you do your thing for a semester, it's done, you have your final review, and then you go off and do another semester. And so everything is about these kind of beginnings and ends, really, really quick. Whereas actually in architecture or landscape, but in architecture, when you finish a project, it's the beginning of something, it's not the end of something. You know, when you finish a project and a client moves in, you know, that's when you get the call to say that the roof is leaking. You know, that's when you hear that there's been an amazing party or some great event, or a family finds itself there, or whatever it is. It's the beginning of something. And I was thinking, how do you bring that idea that you are responsible for the start of something, but it's never finished? And then I thought, okay, well, maybe doing a garden would be a nice way to understand that what you do this semester will only really matter in 5 years' time. So you're going to have to come back and see whether what you do is successful or not, and how it interacts with other things. And that became a really nice, almost like kind of metaphor for how one should act as an architect. But also it brought lots of practical skills. Suddenly realized how little we know about the earth, about soil ecology, how little we know in architecture. You know, every piece of architecture is in the ground, but we know so little about it. And which I think 2 generations ago was very different. Everybody knew how vegetables grow, how flowers grow, how trees grow, how soil works. Everybody had a very direct, physical relationship to landscape. And so this is a way in which people get some kind of contact. I mean, again, it's like the building world. It's not expecting people to become craftspeople, and it's not expecting people to become gardeners or landscape designers, but it's expecting people to have a feeling for dirt under your fingernails when you're clicking away on CAD. You know, that there is some physical and biological reality to the work that you're making digitally. So that's been sort of very important. And I suppose that the thing that goes alongside all these kind of making projects has been the Atlas projects, which are the surveys. So if at a small scale, it's about making them tools and materials and soil and so on, at a larger scale, I would say the tool is the Atlas, the documentation of territorial things, or at least at multiple scales. So from the very, very small to the very, very big. And to some extent, they're the 2 sort of main methodological tools I have. One is the survey, the Atlas, that becomes a collective document. And then the other one is either the garden or the making, which is also a different kind of collective action. And that's the sort of ongoing project. It's developed, but quite slowly. You know, it takes time. But it's been, you know, been at it for now. Yes, it's 14 years at ETH. But it's an amazing environment to do it in with, you know, fantastic colleagues, and it's a very privileged environment to be able to teach in. So. Yeah, so when we did the project in Peru, in Pachacamac, in fact, it was under the invitation of, I think, your friend and colleague, Vincent, who's Swiss, I think. yeah, but lives in Peru, and invited us to do this pavilion in the archaeological park, Pachacamac. It's a very, very important sacred site in Peru, as a kind of collaboration between ETH students and Peruvian students. And so they first went out for a first visit to meet there, and they stayed with the Peruvian students, and they did an atlas project. So the Peruvian students did one, and the ETH students also, they all did one together, which was essentially the kind of the research background to the project. And then they went back a few months later to actually do the design and build project, having kind of immersed themselves in particularly in the context. And so very similar way. I think it took 3 weeks, that one. It wasn't 2 weeks, it was 3 weeks. And then there was a sort of design phase, short design phase that was developed collectively, and then a build phase. And it was a kind of an amazing process, because of course the students had wildly different backgrounds and experiences. The thing that connected them, they were all studying architecture. That's what connected them, but everything else in their lives was very different. And that was really, really interesting because they were all working on the same thing. There wasn't really time to compare notes about, what are you like, what's your culture like, and all the rest of it. It was more like, how do we address this problem? And it was very interesting that you could say the knowledge and different areas of confidence started shifting. So initially, I would say that to start with, it felt like the ETH students had more confidence. Many of them had done this before. So they kind of came in, they knew how to do things. A lot of the Peruvian students didn't really know what was like, how to approach this. They maybe didn't have much experience making things and so on. So they were sort of slightly more passive, and the ETH took but then once the project had a momentum, there was a point at which, these projects always have their crises and lots of arguments and blah, 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 blah. And then there was a moment, I remember, when it felt like we were running out of time. We wouldn't get it finished. And I think the ETH students sort of were getting much more stressed out about this, because they had to go back. They had their ticket home. So this was becoming the source of enormous kind of anxiety. And at that point, I remember there was a suddenly switch around in confidence, that it was the Peruvian students seeing the ETH students sort of get overly stressed out, and they kind of stepped in and became the kind of sort of took over the kind of the momentum or the energy came from them, and they were the ones who goes, we can do this. Okay, this is how we're going to do it. This is what we're going to do. This is how we organize it. You do this, you do this. I know somebody who can supply us with this thing and stuff like that. And they really, you could say, brought in that kind of inner knowledge that you have when you're working in your own place. You suddenly realize, you remember that your uncle knows someone who can fix you with a particular kind of textile, or somebody knows a supplier of Adobe bricks, or somebody can have a much quicker conversation with the authorities, And so it became, and by the end, I would say it was a very special collaboration, where the dominant kind of forces, or the confidence, really shifted through the group at different times in a really kind of in a really interesting way. And I think that certainly the ones I know, because I still know some of the ETH students. It was a very, very important kind of experience for them to do that. And I know that they're all in touch. I know that the WhatsApp groups, the Peruvians are still, they're still doing their thing, and they still send, birthday parties or graduations or stuff like that. So it's a sort of still a live thing. Maybe one of the hardest things to learn is the patience required to do what you want to do. Maybe one of the hardest things to learn is that not everybody is queuing up for you to do your thing. That you have to learn. I think one of the hardest things, you have to learn to do what you believe in while actually meeting the needs of the people for whom you're doing it. And that's a very complex equation, because you have to have your values, you have to have your aims, but in the end, it's not about you. And getting all those things in the right arrangement for work to be productive, to be meaningful, is, I think we're still, that's unfinished business. I think we'll continue to try and work that one out for forever. As far as the future is concerned, I think obviously we all face the same monumental challenge. Actually, that's not true. Not everybody faces the same monumental challenge. But anyway, there is nevertheless a global climate emergency, and we have to find ways of addressing it. It's a very kind of technical project to do with resources, but it's also one which is completely bound up in the social and economic and historical kind of conditions in which we work. And I think that the big challenge now is how to incorporate that matrix of issues in a way that still enables architecture to have a kind of agency, that doesn't defeat architecture, that it still matters to design and to create environments for people and other species, that there's still room for invention. And I think that is the sort of the challenge on the plate. But it's fundamentally different to the one, let's say, that the Smithsons were proposing in the 80s. And so we're all having to kind of shake it up a bit, and so I think that's the project for the next generation at least.